At my grandmother Mary's funeral, her hairdresser Angela pulled me into the parlor's side room, took both my hands with tears streaming down her face, and said words that stopped my heart. She made me promise to wait until she was gone. "You have a sister, Christine. A half-sister your mother gave up decades ago. Your entire family has spent your whole life making sure you never found out. My name is Christine." I was 30 years old, and until that moment at my grandmother's funeral, I believed my family was unremarkable. I had no idea that my mother had given birth to a daughter before I was born, or that my grandmother had spent 40 years carrying that secret to her hairdresser's chair. The only thing I knew for certain was that somewhere out there, I had a sister named Sarah, and I had absolutely no idea how to find her. Angela led me to a worn velvet sofa in that side room, still holding my hands as if I might disappear. She told me everything. For 40 years, my grandmother Mary had sat in Angela's salon chair every Thursday morning, and over time, the appointments became something more. Mary didn't just talk about the weather or church gossip. She talked about the daughter her own child had given away. My mother, Linda, got pregnant when she was 17. The father was a boy from 2 towns over who left before my mother even knew for sure. My grandmother found out late, took control, and made a decision that would shape 3 lives without anyone else's input. The baby was born on March 4th, 1988, a girl. Linda held her for 6 minutes before a nurse took her through a side door. She was told to forget. The family never spoke of it again, but Mary never forgot. She couldn't. And every week, she poured that guilt into Angela's chair until the secret became a kind of shared custody between them. I asked the only question that mattered. "Is my mother going to tell me this herself?" Angela looked down. "Your mother doesn't know I'm telling you." Mary's instructions were specific. "Wait until after the funeral. Tell Christine directly, and give her this." She pressed a small brass key into my palm. "A safety deposit box at First Mercantile Bank." Inside, she said, I would find every piece of paper Mary had gathered about my sister's adoption, plus a trust account with enough money to fund a reunion. Mary had planned this for years. While I was growing up thinking our family tree had exactly 2 branches, my grandmother was quietly building a bridge I didn't know I needed. I left the funeral home that evening with the key in my pocket and a rage building in my chest that I couldn't quite name. I confronted my mother the next morning at her kitchen table. I said the name Sarah. She dropped her coffee cup. It shattered on the tile, and in the silence that followed, her face told me everything Angela said was true. But instead of an apology, she gave me a warning. "Some doors are better left closed, Christine. That girl isn't your sister. She's a mistake I buried 36 years ago. Let it stay buried." She walked out of the room. My father sat frozen, staring at the wall. He'd known all along. They'd both been carrying this secret since before I was born, and they expected me to just carry it now too. But I had that brass key. 2 days later, I sat alone in a small room at First Mercantile Bank, a metal box open on the table in front of me. Inside, there was a yellowed birth certificate with the father's name blank. A photograph of a newborn wrapped in a pale pink blanket. Handwritten notes from Mary tracking every piece of information she could find over the decades. The adoption agency, the lawyer who handled it, a possible city. And at the bottom, a letter addressed to me in my grandmother's handwriting. It started with 4 words: "Find your sister, Christine." I had my orders. I picked up my phone and started looking for a girl I'd never known existed. What I found set everything in motion, and the first phone call changed my life forever. I started with the adoption agency listed on the yellowing paperwork. It was a small private office in a town 40 miles from where I grew up. The building was still there, but the agency had closed in 1994. I called every number I could find for the former director, scoured archived state records, and finally got a name: a paralegal who had worked there in the late 80s. She was retired, living in Florida. I called her 3 times before she agreed to talk. She told me my mother signed the surrender papers 24 hours after giving birth. There was no waiting period and no counseling, just a signature and a closed file. But there was one thing the paralegal remembered. The adopting couple was local, a young family from the same county. They had a very common last name, Mitchell. I searched for hours that night, scrolling through social media profiles, obituaries, anything that might connect a Sarah Mitchell to March 4th, 1988. Nothing. I almost gave up when I tried something my grandmother wrote in the margin of one of her notes. "Check the adoption registry." Most states have a mutual consent registry for adult adoptees and birth families. I filled out the form and mailed it, expecting nothing. 4 days later, I got an email. It said, "Your registration matches an existing file. A contact has been requested. Would you like to proceed?" My hands shook. I typed yes. The next morning, an email appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was empty. The body was 4 words. "I've been looking too." I stared at that sentence, unable to move. Then I picked up the phone and called her. The voice on the other end was quiet and cautious. She said her adoptive parents had told her the truth when she turned 18, but they knew almost nothing. They said her birth mother was a teenager who wanted no contact. No name, no address, just a closed file. She had been searching on and off for 5 years, and now, out of nowhere, I had appeared. We talked for 3 hours that first night. She told me about her life. A school teacher married a little boy named Henry. She lived 200 miles from me, near the coast. She had been raised in a loving home, never wanted for anything, but always felt a shadow she couldn't explain. When she said that, I felt the same cold recognition I'd felt at the funeral, the sensation of a life half-lived because something was missing that you didn't know was missing. I told her about Grandma Mary, the hairdresser, the key, the safety deposit box. I told her about our mother's shattered coffee cup. She listened without interruption, then said, "I have a birth mother who told a stranger I was a mistake, but I have a grandmother who spent 40 years trying to fix it. And I have a sister who flew across every wall to find me. That's more than I had yesterday." We decided to meet. The trust my grandmother left was specifically for this purpose, a reunion with enough for travel and expenses, held not by the bank but by Angela herself. When I called Angela to tell her I had found Sarah, she wept. "Mary made me promise," she said. "She said, don't let that money go to anything else. When Christine finds her, you make it happen." Angela transferred the funds to my account that afternoon. I booked a flight for the following weekend. But Linda found out. She saw a notification on my phone and confronted me in my apartment parking lot. Her face was twisted into something between fury and dread. "You think you're fixing something," she said, her voice low. "But you're about to tear open a wound that destroyed my life. That girl's adoption wasn't some happy arrangement. It was a scandal that would have ruined our family. My parents made it go away, and now you're bringing her back like nothing happened." I asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. She just got in her car and drove off, leaving me with more questions than answers. I called Sarah again, recounting every word. She was quiet, then said, "I've heard that tone before. Adoptive parents sometimes hide things even from the child. What if there's more to this than just a teenage pregnancy? What if something else happened?" She'd done her own digging, she confessed. She'd requested non-identifying information from the agency years ago. Some of it didn't add up. The file mentioned a difficult home environment for the birth mother. Linda grew up in a stable, upper-middle-class family. What difficult environment? I decided to push further. I went back to the safety deposit box and found an envelope I'd overlooked. It was a letter from my grandmother to someone named Dr. Harold Weiss, dated 1989, referencing the situation we discussed. I looked him up. He was a psychiatrist who had treated my mother when she was a teenager. I called his old practice, now run by his son, and persuaded the receptionist to check archives. She found a notation. "Patient Linda, age 17, referral from family court for evaluation following incident." Incident, not pregnancy. Incident. My stomach dropped. I drove to my parents' house that evening unannounced. My father answered. I held up the letter. "What happened to Mom when she was 17? His face went pale. He tried to close the door, but I blocked it. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then tell me what it is." He looked past me at the driveway, then back into the house where Linda was watching television. "It wasn't just a pregnancy," he whispered. "There was a crime. The father wasn't a boy from another town. He was someone who hurt her. And the baby." He couldn't finish. But I knew. The adoption wasn't a choice. It was a consequence of something far darker. And my sister was walking into a reunion with no idea that the story she'd been told was a lie. I was about to board a plane to meet the daughter of a monster, and my family had kept this secret so deep that even my grandmother took it to her hairdresser, but not to me. I had 48 hours to decide what to tell Sarah. And then Angela called with one more thing she'd been holding back from my grandmother's final wishes, something that would change everything again. Angela's voice was trembling. She said my grandmother left one final letter, sealed, not to be opened until after I found Sarah. She'd kept it in a drawer at the salon for 7 years. I drove straight there, still shaking from my father's words. The letter was handwritten, dated 6 months before Mary died. It began, "Christine, if you're reading this, you found your sister. I hope you haven't learned the rest yet, but if you have, I'm sorry. There are things even Angela doesn't know." I read on, my heart pounding. Mary had been secretly watching Sarah her entire life. She hired a private investigator to locate the adoptive family, then arranged to meet them under a false name, posing as a family friend. Every year on Sarah's birthday, Mary drove to the coast and sat outside her school just to see her walk past. She kept a hidden album of photographs, newspaper clippings of Sarah's achievements, even a lock of hair from her first haircut, procured by the pie. She'd been a silent guardian, present at Sarah's wedding, her son's birth, all without revealing her identity. The final line read, "I never told Linda because she couldn't bear it, but you can. The trust isn't just for a meeting, it's for whatever comes next. I've already loved her for both of us. Now it's your turn." I sat in Angela's salon chair, unable to speak. My grandmother hadn't just kept a secret. She'd lived a parallel life of devotion to a child her family had thrown away. The photos in the album showed a girl with my mother's eyes, my grandmother's smile, growing up in a world I'd never known. Angela said, "She made me promise to give you the album when you were ready." I think you're ready. I took it home and spent the night turning pages, watching my sister become a woman I'd never met. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house. I didn't call ahead. I walked in and placed the album on the kitchen table. Linda stared at it, then at me, her face crumpled. "She knew," she whispered. I told her everything. For an hour, we sat in the wreckage of a lifetime of silence. Linda finally told me the truth about the incident. The man who assaulted her was her father's business partner, a man named Carl Eberhardt. He was powerful, well-connected, and my grandparents were terrified of scandal. They hushed it up, paid for a private adoption, and sent Linda to a psychiatrist to move past it. Carl was never charged. He still lived in town, a respected businessman, attending the same church as my parents. He had no idea he'd fathered a child. And Linda had to see him every week at the grocery store, at social events, at Sunday service. The horror settled over me like a shroud. My sister's existence wasn't just a secret. It was evidence of a crime that had been buried so deep the perpetrator still walked free. I asked Linda if Carl knew. She shook her head. "He thinks I had an abortion. My mother told him it was handled. He believed it." So Carl had been living his life, oblivious, while my grandmother secretly watched over the child he created through violence. That night, Sarah called again. Her voice was different, tighter. She'd received a packet from the adoption agency containing non-identifying medical history. It mentioned that the birth father had a history of aggression and was likely a known individual to the birth mother. She said, "Christine, was I a product of something terrible?" I couldn't lie. I told her everything I'd learned. There was a long silence, then the sound of her crying. But when she spoke again, her voice was steel. "Then we have two things to do. We meet as sisters, and we make sure Carl Eberhardt knows the truth." I spent the next day preparing. I called a lawyer, a friend of Margaret's, to understand whether Carl could face any legal consequences, but the statute of limitations had expired. Still, exposure was possible. I also called my father, asking why he'd stayed silent. He said he'd protected Linda because he loved her, and burying the past seemed like the only way. "We all made a choice," he said, his voice hollow. "And every year it got harder to undo." I realized that my family was a house of cards built on a foundation of fear. The night before I flew to meet Sarah, I stood in my grandmother's rose garden, now overgrown. I thought about how she'd carried her guilt and love in equal measure, tending those roses while secretly tending a granddaughter from afar. Angela called one last time. She said, "Mary always believed you'd be the one to break the cycle. She said Christine has a backbone made of something stronger than fear." I hung up and packed my bag with the photo album, the trust documents, and a single rose from the garden. In the morning, I would board a plane and finally meet my sister. And when I did, we would sit down over coffee and decide what justice looked like for the family that had been, and the family we were about to become. I landed at a small coastal airport, the air thick with salt and something I couldn't name. Sarah was waiting outside baggage claim with her husband and little Henry asleep in a stroller. We didn't speak at first. We just stood there, looking at each other's faces for traces of the woman who'd watched us both from a distance. Then she stepped forward, and we held each other like we were trying to bridge 36 years in a single breath. We drove to a coffee shop near the harbor, the same one Mary had sat in a decade earlier, watching Sarah through the window. I placed the photo album on the table. Sarah turned the pages slowly, seeing our grandmother's hidden devotion for the first time. Her first day of kindergarten, her high school graduation, her wedding, all captured from the edge of a crowd. When she found the lock of hair, she pressed it to her cheek and wept. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a homecoming arranged by a ghost. That evening, we made a plan about Carl Eberhardt. Sarah's husband is a journalist. He knew how to expose a man like that without risking a libel suit. The goal wasn't legal retribution. The law had failed us decades ago. The goal was truth. Linda agreed, reluctantly, to provide a written statement detailing the assault. I typed it up in her living room while she sat rigid on the couch, her hands trembling. My father signed as a corroborating witness. We packaged everything: the statement, the letter from Mary to the psychiatrist, the agency records showing Carl's name redacted but implied. Then Sarah and I drove to the church where Carl had been a deacon for 20 years. The Sunday service was just ending when we walked in. Carl shook hands with the pastor near the altar. I felt my mother's fear buzzing in my veins, but Sarah's hand on my arm steadied me. We approached the deacon's bench where Carl's wife and grown children sat. I introduced myself as Linda's daughter. The color drained from his face, but before he could speak, Sarah said calmly, "My name is Sarah. I was born on March 4th, 1988. I believe you knew my birth mother." The silence swallowed the room. Carl's wife turned to him with a question forming, but his eyes were fixed on Sarah as if seeing a ghost. We didn't make a scene. We simply placed a folder on the pew beside him, the truth, documented and undeniable. Then we walked out. By that evening, half the town knew. Carl resigned from the church board by Monday morning. His business clients began to call seeking contract cancellations. Within 3 months, he sold his company and moved away. It wasn't justice in a courtroom, but it was the kind of accountability that a wealthy man in a small town cannot buy his way out of. Linda called me the night after the church visit. Her voice was raw but lighter, as if a tumor had been excised. She asked to speak to Sarah. I handed over the phone and listened as my mother, for the first time in decades, said the words she'd never been allowed to say. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I was wrong." Sarah listened, then said simply, "I understand why you did it, but I'm glad you're my sister's mother." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door cracked open. The biggest surprise came a week later when Angela called me back to the salon. She had one final envelope, this one from Mary, addressed not to me, but to Sarah directly. It was dated the year before Mary died. Inside was a handwritten letter that began, "My dearest Sarah, though you do not know me, I have loved you every day of your life. Forgive your mother. She was a child who survived something no child should. And forgive me for watching from the shadows. I hope one day you'll sit in my garden and know that I planted roses for you." Beneath the letter was a bond certificate worth $50,000, payable to Sarah with the memo, "For Henry's education." Mary had funded not just a reunion, but a future. Sarah read it aloud to Henry that night, even though he was too young to understand. She said she'd tell him everything when he was old enough, about the grandmother who never forgot him, and the aunt who refused to let her family's silence become her own. Before I flew home, we sat one last time at the same coffee shop. The harbor light was golden on the water. I asked her what she wanted to do next. She smiled. "I'd like to see your grandmother's garden. I want to smell those roses." I told her they bloom every May, and she was welcome any time. The flight home felt like the closing of a chapter. But the real question, the one that stayed with me after the reunion, was this: when a family secret is finally exposed, what do you do with the wreckage? And the answer, I discovered, is built one honest moment at a time. Mary spent 40 years in a salon chair, pouring her heart to a woman who held every secret and still returned each week with a warm smile. She couldn't undo the past or force her daughter to face the truth, but she could plant seeds that would bloom long after she was gone. Those seeds became a trust, a brass key, a photo album, and a granddaughter she loved from the shadows. What she built wasn't just a reunion. It was proof that even the deepest family betrayal can be answered with care that outlasts a lifetime. I still visit Angela at her salon. Her chair still holds decades of other people's secrets, and she tells me Mary would be proud. Last month, Sarah flew in and we sat together in my grandmother's garden. The roses were in full bloom, exactly as Mary promised. Henry played in the grass while our mother watched from the porch, still hesitant but present for the first time. It wasn't a perfect ending because families like ours don't get perfect. We get progress, measured in coffee cups and phone calls and the slow rebuilding of trust. So here's my question for you. Have you ever learned a family secret that rewrote your entire story? Or has a stranger like Angela ever been entrusted with a truth no one else could hold? I read every comment, and I want to know what you're carrying. If this story stayed with you, please hit like and subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that reconciliation is possible, even after decades of silence. Drop your city and local time below, because I love knowing where these stories find you. The truth can be buried, but it never really dies. Sometimes it just needs a gardener patient enough to wait for the bloom.